Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the State Bar of Michigan Negligence Law section and the American Board of Trial Advocates Michigan chapter seminar on post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma-informed advocacy. Before we start our program, I want to thank our sponsors, Riley and Hurley and the Sinus Dramus Law Firm. And very importantly, I want to thank shared resources, our administrative team that we share between the BOTA and the State Bar Negligence Law section. And a special thanks to Matt Hinkle for all of his hard work getting this program put together and helping us to present it. Why are we all here? And looking at the audience members that registered for this event, we're almost preaching to the choir, but we have a group of lawyers, judges, and medical professionals together to help learn about this concept of trauma-informed advocacy or get a better understanding of resources that are available. How we conduct ourselves, how we treat people matters. The first rule of medicine we've all heard is do no harm. Well, the second rule of medicine and the very first rule of law ought to be do no further harm. Litigation, which is unnecessarily adversarial or antagonistic or disrespectful, can be destructive and is actually counterproductive. Trauma-informed advocacy is not just a courtesy, it implicates our duty for respect of litigants, witnesses, and for the process under our rules of professional responsibility and our obligations of professionalism and civility. Recognizing the need for this program, we set out to bring you resources and subject matter experts to help you learn more. In fact, one of our section members, Rebecca Sposita, just had a book published on this topic. It's called Win-Win, Helping Organizations Mitigate Legal Risk for the Common Good, What Every Executive, Risk Manager, and HR Director Needs to Know. I'm going to put the link for this book in the chat, and I've read it. I strongly encourage practitioners from healthcare, business, and the legal profession to read this book. It's excellent. For our leadoff speaker today, we have assembled a panel of experts. And for our leadoff speaker, we couldn't decide whether we wanted a doctor or a lawyer. So we compromised and chose someone who was both. Dr. Gerard Morgan graduated law school and then took a break for 4 years to teach English in Japan. That not being enough, he got accepted into medical school, attended and graduated the Pacific Northwest University medical program, completed his general psychiatry residency at Michigan State University Pine Rest, and completed a forensic psychiatry fellowship at the University of Michigan. Go Blue! He's board certified in both general and forensic psychiatry. And at Pine Rest, he also collaborates with our next speaker, who will be Jill Mulder. She graduated Cooley Law School for a law degree, and then completed a health law LLM at Purdue School of Law in healthcare, and also received additional training at Harvard's Medical School postgraduate education program. She's an associate adjunct professor in the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Program at MSU Medical School, is affiliated with Pine Rest, and is very active in the State Bar of Michigan. She has served on a number of committees, including the Michigan Character and Fitness Committee as a district chair, and serves currently on the Judicial Qualification Committee as well. And finally, we wanted someone on the front lines in a very hands-on way in dealing with crisis and trauma, and who better than a nurse, because nurses are on the front line of healthcare, and they're often on the front line of trauma. Our final speaker today will be Kelly Clement. She holds a bachelor's in nursing from the University of Michigan and completed a master's in nursing administration from Southern New Hampshire University. She is an experienced nurse, a claims manager for a major healthcare system. She has vast experience dealing with people in crisis and special training, and extensive experience in helping victims of sexual trauma. She is a leader in institutional response to adverse events, and she'll also be helping us to co-moderate and co-host this presentation today by answering questions that are submitted in the question and answer section of the Zoom log. One last caveat. We will answer questions at the end, but everything that you hear today is general educational information for you. It is not legal advice, it's not medical advice, and represents the opinions and views of the speakers themselves personally, and not any institution or employer that they're affiliated with. With that, Dr. Morgan, we will turn the podium virtually over to you. If you can put up your slides.
All right, I'll do so right away here. Hoping this works on the first try. There we go. Did everybody able to see that? Excellent. All right, so I'll be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder today, giving a primer on that. So a little bit about myself. As Mr. Engelhardt already said, I went to Pacific Northwest University for medical school. Before that, going way back, I went to Grinnell College in Iowa for undergrad, then went to law school at Seattle University School of Law, practiced primarily in personal injury for about 4 years before heading off to Japan and then coming back to the United States to go to medical school. And then, as he said, Pine Rest for residency and U of M for my forensic training. So I'm not originally a Michigander. I'm originally from Walla Walla, Washington, and actually came to Michigan to go to Pine Rest for residency. So that was my big draw. We loved it here and we decided to stay afterwards. So a little bit about Pine Rest. I know that not everybody watching this is going to be familiar. So Pine Rest is a psychiatric hospital as well as an outpatient provider, primarily in Michigan, although we do get patients from outside of Michigan as well. We're one of the 5 largest freestanding behavioral health providers in the United States. We have around 200 inpatient beds, so we're enormous. We have a lot of different specialties. So the 2 big areas that I work with are, well, 3 big areas are outpatient psychiatry, forensic psychiatric and psychological services, and neuromodulation, which is electroconvulsive therapy. And then we also provide services throughout the entire age range, from child and adolescent, where we have inpatient, partial, and outpatient providers, and then older adult in both the inpatient and outpatient realms. We also offer addiction services, peripartum mental health disorder treatment, and one of our newest things, the psychiatric urgent care that we've had now for about 4 years, and has been a real boon to the community as well by taking some pressure off of providers when patients are in acute crisis. So my current practice is about 70% outpatient, which is primarily general psychiatric practice of my own. And I also supervise residents, Michigan State University residents, as well as doing the electroconvulsive therapy. And then 30% of my work is in forensic evaluations and administration. So I'm one of the associate program directors for our forensic psychiatry fellowship program. And then my forensic evaluations are split roughly 50-50 at the moment between criminal and civil work that I do. So what I'll be talking about today is I'm going to give a little bit of a primer on diagnosing PTSD, giving a difference between clinical versus forensic evaluations, some diagnostic criteria, and then some other trauma diagnoses. And then you'll see where I have clinical versus forensic at the top, and then I have it at the bottom as well. It's because I moved that section, so sorry about not correcting that. Then I'll talk some about the impact of PTSD, both on the individual, on the society, and then a little bit about memory. I do a lot of testimony about memory, so I felt that was a really good piece to bring in as well, especially since when in the legal realm, we're working a lot with people who really need to know what they remember. And then treatment of PTSD, and then finishing off with the difference between clinical and forensic assessment. So getting started with PTSD. So PTSD, this is going to be based on the DSM-5 TR. So the DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, and the TR is text revision. So this is our newest edition of the DSM. This one came out in 2022, so it's been out just a couple of years now. So any forensic or clinical professional who's doing mental health work should be familiar with the DSM-5 TR, and diagnoses that you see in the forensic and the clinical realm should be based on the DSM-5 TR. And that's if we're talking about therapists or psychiatrists. Regular medical providers may not actually use the DSM-5 TR and may be more general about their diagnoses. Using an older DSM edition, at least in the context of forensic work, gives kind of an implication that whoever is providing the diagnosis may not be completely up to date. And the big difference between the DSM-5 and the DSM-4, for those who are familiar with the DSM-4, is the DSM-5 got rid of the axes method, which was, you had axis 1, which was their mental health and substance use diagnoses. Axis 2 were any personality diagnoses. Axis 3 was general medical conditions. 4 was psychosocial and environmental problems. And Axis 5 was that mysterious global assessment of functioning. Although everybody is largely using the DSM-5 now, there are still some jurisdictions that still use the DSM-4, usually federal jurisdictions that might still be using the DSM-4. So the primary purpose of the DSM is for clinical use. So that's what it was designed for. It offers consistent and reliable diagnostic framework that allows essentially a language that medical providers can, in a way, medical providers can communicate with each other and understand what they're trying to get across there. It also provides a framework where insurance is able to understand what the person's been diagnosed with and whether the treatment that's being given is appropriate. So in the forensic context, it also provides an established system of diagnoses, which of course improves the value and reliability of those determinations in the forensic context. And that, once again, gives that common language. And that the diagnosis is a reliable one based upon the symptoms that were present. The DSM-5 TR definitions, though, aren't always consistent with legal definitions. So that's one really big important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at the DSM-5. So not every diagnosis that you find in the DSM-5 is a mental illness as defined by law. So, for example, in Michigan, the Michigan Mental Health Code defines a mental illness as a substantial disorder of thought or mood that significantly impairs judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or the ability to cope with the ordinary demands of life. And then lastly, the presence of a diagnosis does not tell us the level of impairment that somebody's experiencing with that diagnosis. So you could have a diagnosis, but currently not be suffering any impairment from it, or you could have really severe debilitating impairment from it. So when we're talking about PTSD, a mnemonic that I like to work with is something called the FIGHT mnemonic. So FIGHT, so these are not in order. It's just a really easy way to remember the categories that we're looking at. So flight is there's some sort of avoidance. Intrusive symptoms, those are going to be nightmares, flashbacks, memories. Gloomy cognitions refers to the negative cognitions of mood, the changes in mood and cognition associated with the traumatic event. And hypervigilance talks about changes in a person's arousal to stimuli. And then last is trauma. Of course, trauma should be first in the diagnostic criteria, but for the sake of the mnemonic, it's very useful for remembering the 5 big categories we're looking at. So to talk about the individual criteria, criterion A is exposure. So this is exposure to the trauma. So exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So a serious injury is, we're looking at a loss of physical integrity or something that seriously impacts somebody. So nothing like scratches, bumps, bruises, like minor injuries are not going to be sufficient for criterion A of PTSD. Now, interpretation of this can be somewhat subjective because, of course, physical abuse of a child is much more likely to qualify for criterion A than domestic violence may be amongst adults. Also, we have when it comes to that injury, there's 4 possibilities to the exposure. One, it can be a personally experienced trauma. So the actual person that's being evaluated was exposed to the trauma, witnessed in person. So this is something that they saw happen. So they saw somebody get seriously injured. They saw somebody suddenly die. And it need not be someone that's even close to them. So you're going to see this most commonly for emergency service professionals than you are for the average person. Or another criteria is that they learned of the violent or accidental event happening to a close family member or a close friend. So in this particular case, watching the news would not count. So something that's happening over in the Middle East would not meet criterion A unless a person has a close friend or close family member who is in the middle of that. And then the last one that we're looking at is repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of a traumatic event. So this one was designed in order to bring in people who are in traumatic civilian occupations. So police officers who are repeatedly exposed to violent crimes, or in the debriefing of the violent crimes, or having to testify about those violent crimes, just repeatedly talking about the same crime over and over again outside of a clinical context. Also, firefighters exposed to charred remains, Coast Guard personnel who are exposed to drowned bodies, so on. So criterion B is intrusion. So what we're looking at here is recurrent. So there's several categories here as well. Current, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the event. So intrusive refers to unwanted and persistent experiencing or persistent memories. So it's not a memory that somebody's trying to remember. And once they do remember, it's not something that they're able to stop remembering or distract themselves from. So it's something that's involuntary and intrusive. Another one is recurrent distressing dreams related to the event. So nightmares would be the common association there. Dissociative reactions while acting or feeling like the event is recurring. So these oftentimes people, they say they're having a flashback, but in fact, they're just having a memory. So a flashback is a dissociative experience. So it's a disconnection from reality. So it's a sense of being disconnected from yourself, which we call depersonalization, or being disconnected from the environment, which we call derealization. Some people describe it as an out-of-body experience, or watching their life or events around them play out like they're in a movie. And we've actually all experienced dissociation at some point in our lives. The classic example I like to give is if you're going on a really long drive at night, it's like you pass milepost 100, and then an hour later you're passing milepost 160. And you're like, whoa, I don't remember anything that happened in between mile 100 and 160. So it's just kind of this separation from reality. You're just kind of experiencing everything without being connected to it. And another thing with flashbacks is flashbacks aren't just like, I'm seeing it again. It's a full sensory experience. So it's a full sensory experience of the traumatic event. So they're smelling it, they're hearing it, they're feeling it. It's all happening again. Another category is an intense or prolonged distress with cues that symbolize or resemble the event. So it's not a literal representation of the event. It's usually something more symbolic. Same with the marked physiological reaction with cues that symbolize or resemble the event. So when we're saying marked physiological reaction, we're talking similar to like a panic attack where people start breathing really hard or having trouble breathing, heart's pounding, they're sweating, shaking, crying, fainting, vomiting. So a really intense reaction is what we're thinking of in that situation. So criterion C is avoidance. So when we're talking avoidance, we're talking about a new avoidant behavior or a big change in their avoidant behavior. So if you have somebody who has traditionally always avoided dogs because they're afraid of dogs, and then they cross a dog on the wrong day at the wrong time, and they get mauled by the dog, but their avoidance patterns don't change at all, then that would not necessarily meet criterion A because criterion C, because there's no change in their avoidance. If their avoidance gets more severe, or if they change their patterns of avoidance, things like that, then that would meet criterion C in that case. So avoidance is often unconscious in nature. This is one of the hardest ones to parse out because a lot of the time the person that you're evaluating does not even realize that they're avoiding something. And we're not necessarily looking for avoidance of a literal event, but something more symbolic or representative once again. So a classic example there is somebody who was in a Humvee over in Afghanistan. They encountered an IED, and now they're back stateside again. But every time they smell diesel, they have a flashback. So they start avoiding gas stations. They avoid driving diesel cars, things like that. So they're not like avoiding IEDs, which we're all doing, but they're avoiding something that symbolizes that event in their life. And another good example of the avoidance is a child who's experienced a traumatic event. when they're testifying or when they're sharing what happened to them, they might just be completely devoid of emotion. So they're avoiding the emotions associated with their trauma. And so they just kind of become stoic or flat as they talk about it, because they're avoiding experiencing the emotion as they're sharing. So next would be criterion D. These are negative cognitions and mood. So here, once again, we've got 7 different categories that we're looking at here. One would be an inability to remember important aspects of the event. So traumatic events, I'll be talking more in detail about this one later. Traumatic events can interfere with our ability to make memories. Also, this needs to be a dissociative reaction, the lack of memory. So it's not due to physical damage. So if somebody is in an accident and they suffer severe head trauma and they don't remember because of that, that does not meet criterion D. So this has to be memories unassociated with the actual physical brain trauma they may have experienced. Then persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about themselves, others, and the world. So an example here, sadly, would be like a child believing that they were abused because they are inherently unlovable. Another is blame of self or an unassociated other, so someone not involved in the trauma. So blame of self or an unassociated other for causing the event or its consequences. So for example, classic one here would be a woman blaming herself for being sexually assaulted rather than casting the blame on the person that it belongs to. Persistent negative emotional states, so anger, horror, fear that just doesn't stop, it's continuous. Marked anhedonia, so it's a lack of any pleasure, lack of any pursuit of pleasure. Detachment or estrangement from others, so someone may no longer feel emotionally invested in or emotionally connected with their children, and or persistent inability to experience positive emotions. And one of the last big criteria is criterion E, and this is arousal and reactivity. So here, irritability and angry outbursts, that kind of speaks to itself. And these are changes in the person's arousal and reactivity. So if somebody's always been really irritable and short-tempered, we wouldn't look at this and be like, oh, they're meeting criterion E, because there's no change in their irritability and anger. So we're looking for changes since the trauma occurred. Reckless or self-destructive behavior. So we can see increased risk-taking, so increased substance use, increased gambling, blowing up other areas of their life, like impulsively cheating on their spouse, telling off their boss and losing their job. So things along those lines. Hypervigilance. So this is a need to be aware of your surroundings. So everyone's heard the term head on a swivel, so they kind of understand that aspect. Or you can also see it in people who constantly have their back to a wall. Like they're out in public, they'll sit in a corner at a restaurant, things along those lines. Exaggerated startle response, so somebody's now jumpy since having since their trauma. Problems with concentration, so they can't keep their mind focused on tasks due to distraction by their intrusive thoughts. And then sleep disturbance, such as insomnia or hypersomnia, which is lack of sleep or excessive sleep. Sorry, I'll try to define my terms here rather than not. So the last 3 criteria, I'm just throwing them all together on a single slide because there's not much to say. These are F, G, and H. F, G, and H are pretty common in most of the psychiatric diagnoses, and this is going to be duration, impairment, and attribution. So the duration for PTSD needs to be greater than 1 month. So different diagnoses have different lengths, different durations that are needed to make the diagnosis. In the case of trauma, if the diagnosis has lasted less than a month, and there's definitely a trauma diagnosis there, it's likely to be different than PTSD. PTSD, we can't diagnose it until they've been experiencing symptoms at least a month. Clinically significant impairment is another piece. So what aspects of their life are being impacted by their symptoms? Are they having difficulties social? Are they having trouble connecting with their friends? Are they, like the example given, are they getting angry at work and telling off their boss? Are there other aspects of their life that are being hindered by their trauma? And then lastly, the last thing we have to look at is not attributable to the effects of a substance or a medical condition. So intoxicating substances and certain medications can produce symptoms similar to PTSD, or at least produce some of the symptoms of PTSD. So it's really important to have a solid idea of what a person's taking, as well as what kind of substances a person is using, in order to take a look at things. Like if a person's really started using a whole lot of caffeine since their trauma occurred, then that could be causing their symptoms of anxiety. That could be causing their insomnia. So we have to kind of parse all of that out to see. And then also certain medical conditions can cause some similar symptoms as well. Sleep apnea is your classic one for interfering with sleep. Anemia, which is low blood cell count, can negatively impact mood. And then thyroid conditions can both lower mood and increase arousal. So I also want to talk a little bit there. So there's several trauma diagnoses. So we're all familiar with, or we've all heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the one that we see the most in media. But there's other ones as well. There's some specific pediatric diagnoses as well. There's reactive attachment disorder, and that's where we see a child who's been traumatized in some way, who no longer seeks or accepts comfort from their caregivers. The opposite of that is, or close to the opposite of that, is a disinhibited social engagement disorder. And this is where a child, due to the trauma, ceases being inhibited around strangers. So they become overly friendly with strangers, may wander off with a stranger and be found chatting with them in the grocery store as their parents are desperately looking for them. Acute stress disorder is another one. So this one is very similar to PTSD. This is kind of lead up to PTSD is one way to look at it. So this happens from the 3-day mark to about the 30-day mark after a trauma. Several of the symptoms are similar to PTSD, and a certain number need to be present in order to make the diagnosis. Adjustment disorder is another one. I'm sure many of you have seen this one in your client records. So an adjustment disorder, this is a clear stressor that has triggered a disproportionate emotional or behavioral response. So a big difference here is this is a stressor as opposed to a trauma. So there's some that's really caused a lot of stress, not necessarily traumatize the person, but cause a lot of stress. And this is going to start within about 3 months of their exposure to the stressor. And it's inherently self-limiting as well. So we expect it to be fully resolved within 6 months of the end of the stressor. Usually it's done within 3 months, but it's going to be somewhere in that 3 to 6 month window where we expect complete resolution. And this one has some forensic quandaries related with it. So in litigation, there's kind of that issue of, okay, are the symptoms that they're experiencing, is it due to the stress of litigation, or is it due to the stress of what happened to them? So that's something that really needs to be parsed out with an adjustment disorder. Another issue with it is from the clinical standpoint, this is a really liberally used diagnosis when a clinician is not able to find sufficient criteria to make another diagnosis. And so they may just say, okay, adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or adjustment disorder with anxiety. And so oftentimes that can limit its usefulness and potentially could almost render it meaningless, depending on what symptoms are present, how long they've been around, and so on. Oftentimes as well, the adjustment disorder diagnosis involves depressive or anxious symptoms, as I mentioned there before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone is depressed or that somebody's anxious. They just have symptoms that are similar to those. So depression and anxiety are different diagnoses, different categories. So another is prolonged grief disorder. This is something that gets diagnosed when somebody's still experiencing an intense emotional response and ongoing interference with their life more than 12 months after someone has died, someone close to them has died. Other specified trauma or stressor-related disorder, we use this one when there is a disordered trauma or stress reaction, but it doesn't meet full criteria for another one. Like there's very clearly some problem being caused by it, but doesn't fit neatly into something else. And so we may use that other specified trauma or stressor-related disorder. And lastly is the unspecified trauma or stressor-related disorder. So this is a disordered trauma or stress reaction that does not meet another trauma disorder, but the clinician has declined to say why. So if you're going to do the other specified, you have to say why it doesn't meet criteria. And when you use the unspecified, you just don't say. So we see this often in clinical assessment when not all the symptoms are clear yet. You can see that really often if somebody is acutely psychotic, for example, and we may call it an unspecified psychosis because they're not able to share what's happening yet. or if they just haven't determined all of the symptoms yet. So that's often when you're going to see the unspecified. In terms of a forensic assessment, an unspecified trauma or stressor disorder is a little bit of a red flag, because a thorough, open assessment with collateral should be able to explain why or why not a diagnosis is valid. So it raises the questions of, well, is the person being evaluated? Are they being open and honest? Are they trying to hide something? Or is the evaluator trying to avoid an unfavorable report? Things along those lines. So definitely, if you see unspecified trauma or stress-related disorder, it's a really good idea to press for more information. So I want to talk a little bit about, now that I've gotten to the really dry stuff, I'll go on to the semi-dry stuff here. And this is going to be the impact of PTSD. So in terms of individual impacts, so about 2/3 of people with PTSD already have or will develop another diagnosis. So it definitely has a serious mental health impact, in that if they develop PTSD, they may go on to develop a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, or some other long-term disorder that's not going to get better. Additionally, if they had a diagnosis beforehand, then they're going to be even more vulnerable to developing PTSD. So some common common co-occurring disorders, so disorders that happen at the same time as PTSD. We commonly see bipolar disorder along with PTSD, and bipolar disorder has a lot of different flavors to it here. All right, just getting something out of the way here. A lot of different flavors to it. So bipolar 1 has extreme highs and abnormally low lows, but not like extreme lows. On the flip side, bipolar 2, we see extreme lows, but mildly abnormal highs. So the bipolar diagnoses can also be really easily confused with personality disorders. And so it's really important to get those parsed out as well. Depression is another. So this is where we see an extremely low, debilitating mood. Anxiety disorders are intense, uncontrollable worry. And substance use disorders. So other impacts that we see on a person's life who's experiencing PTSD, it can be really emotionally taxing for their loved ones because they're feeling emotionally detached. They may be having nightmares and thrashing around in bed. They are no longer enjoying the things they used to enjoy. They're just not the same person that they had been before. And that can be really hard for the people who love them. Also, it's difficult not only to maintain their relationships, but to form new relationships because they're just not connecting to others on an emotional level. It also impacts their ability to work and can negatively impact their sense of self-worth. And then there's some big picture impacts as well of PTSD. So PTSD is responsible for high levels of societal, occupational, and physical disability. So from 1999 through 2004, payments for disability increased by about 42%. But for PTSD, they increased by 149%. So massive increase in payouts for PTSD. It's also the most prevalent of military service-connected mental disorders. So from 1999 through 2010, veterans receiving PTSD disability rose 222%. Mind you, this was, of course, during the aftermath of Desert Shield, during Desert Storm, as well as the War on Terror, and then ongoing military involvements in Afghanistan and the Middle East during that time frame. So it's not surprising at all that we saw such a big increase with 11 years of conflict. And then as of 2013, PTSD was responsible for 6.8% of all disability payments to veterans. So if you imagine all of the physical injuries that people get disability for, all the other mental health injuries, 6.8% is a huge number. And then in terms of disability ratings in excess of 70%, only about 3.8% of veterans will be rewarded that level of disability, where their disability is considered to be greater than 70%. Those with mental health diagnosis, close to 35% are awarded that level. So mental health has a really big impact on people's functioning. With that in mind as well, though, one important thing to remember about PTSD is it is estimated that 20 to 30% of all cases of PTSD are malingered. And that can be for disability reasons, injury reasons, all sorts of things. So there's also considerable economic cost to PTSD. So Social Security disability payments, Social Security medical payments, disabled persons in turn are less able to contribute back into the system as they in a way that they were able to before their injuries or their traumas. There's also a high level of medical utilization associated with PTSD. So people with PTSD, they need psychiatric care and they need psychotherapeutic care, and these are scarce resources. To kind of give you an idea of how much of a shortage there is, psychiatry has been an immensely popular specialty for medical graduates over the past decade. It's been one of the hardest specialties to get into over about the past 10 years. Despite this, and despite the growing number of psychiatric residencies out there, there's still expected to be a decrease in the total workforce of about 20% between now and 2030. So even despite all the interest in psychiatry and all the medical students going into psychiatry, the available workforce continues to shrink. And during that same period, 2024 through 2030, there's expected to be an increased demand of about 3%. So as supply decreases, demand is increasing. It's anticipated that in total, there'll be about a shortage of about 12,000 psychiatrists nationwide by 2030. There's also a definite cost to incorrectly diagnosed PTSD as well, because if it's incorrectly diagnosed, then you have a patient who's receiving the wrong treatment for their disorder, which could result in a worse prognosis for them. So it's really important to have the right diagnosis so you can receive the right treatment. And on top of that, then the patients with genuine PTSD may not be able to access treatment because somebody with an incorrect diagnosis is receiving that treatment. So it's a really important thing, an important diagnosis to get right. And of course, it skews medical research as well, which then can hurt the accuracy of PTSD research. A small amount, and it's not going to be a huge amount, but enough that it's problematic. So in terms of forensics, PTSD is the basis of a lot of civil suits, both in mild and severe injury. It's one of the most common grounds now for disability claims. And it's often used also in the criminal context to minimize or mitigate criminal sentences. It's not so much a problem in Michigan, since Michigan doesn't really allow mitigation, but at the federal level, you definitely have the mitigation issue. And then in other states, you have the mitigation issue to keep in mind. Another thing is that PTSD is an abnormal response to trauma. So 61% of men will experience a sufficiently severe trauma to meet criterion A, but only 8% of those will develop PTSD. So that comes out to about 5% of men will develop PTSD at some point in their life. In contrast, 51% of women experience a criterion A trauma, but only 20% of those are going to develop PTSD. So a total of about 10% of all women will develop PTSD. So about twice as many as men. And then the likelihood of trauma. So you're most likely, people most likely to develop PTSD are going to be women or men who are raped, because that's going to be about 49% of those are going to develop PTSD. So still, it's the minority that who are going to develop PTSD, but it is the highest risk category. In contrast, the lowest would be about 2.3% of people who are involved in a car accident. And I'm going to fill in some of the gaps here as well, because I don't want to say that all car accidents are only going to be about 2.3%, because there's a lot of stuff that can happen in a car accident as well. So 31.9% of people who are severely beaten can develop PTSD. 23.7% who are sexually assaulted without penetration will develop PTSD. 16.8% who have a serious accident, so that can include a serious car accident. So when we say car accidents 2.3, we're discounting the serious car accident. So this is going to be a lesser car accident. 15.4% from shootings or stabbings, 8% from muggings or physical threats, 7.3% who witness the sudden death of another, and then 3.8% those who experience a natural disaster. So I want to kind of throw memory into here as well. So PTSD can have impacts on memory. We mentioned that before as well. So this is a topic I actually give quite a few lectures on to residents and fellows each year is memory. I also offer expert testimony on the differences between adult and child memory. So you've got three big types of memory that we're going to be talking about: immediate, recent, remote. So immediate memory is memory that occurred that of stuff that happened seconds ago. Recent memory is minutes to days, and remote is months to years. So there's a number of key brain structures. I'm going to keep this super short because I know nobody wants to really listen to a bunch of talk about brain structures. So the hippocampus is the primary part of the brain where memories are consolidated and stored. So the amygdala then is in charge of emotional memory. So if you have an emotional memory about something, it's because the amygdala participated in the creation of that memory. The dorsal medial nucleus is something that recognizes what's around us and also pulls up recent memories. So it holds on to those recent memories until they get stored into long-term memory. And then the mammillary bodies are what allow us to make memories from events. So if an event occurs or something happens to us, it's the mammillary bodies that allow us to remember what happened. And these are particularly susceptible to alcohol use. So people who have had really high levels of alcohol use for many years, they've pretty much dissolved their mammillary bodies at that point, and they experience something that we call confabulation, where something happens to them, they have no memory of it, but they try to come up with a reasonable explanation for it. So that's what confabulation is there. And then damage to any of these structures, though, can lead to memory issues. So in the TBI context, this is really important. So when we're making memories, so there's three big processes we're talking about when we're talking about memories. The first is encoding. So this is gathering and interpreting the information around us. Of course, environmental factors can impact what we see. So lighting, eyesight, distractions all impact what the information we're able to gather. And then in terms of how we interpret it, that's a subconscious activity that is based on our pasts and our presuppositions and things along those lines. This is probably the most common error where we're seeing things during a traumatic experience. So focus during a traumatic experience focuses on the traumatic event, not so much on what else is going on around you. So people who have suffered a trauma, they may remember, well, yeah, I was in a car accident, but not really be able to share any details. They might remember, well, I started passing a truck, and then I was hitting some signs, and then I was waking up and my car was smoking at the side of the road. They're just missing all these little bits in between. And that can be due to dissociation during the event because their brain just couldn't follow everything that was happening. And it can also be an encoding error. So when this happens, it doesn't mean that they lost consciousness. It just means that they weren't connected to what was going on at the time. So a dissociative reaction or a lack of encoding. Storing information is what we do between encoding and retrieval. So retrieval being the third and final step. So that storing information that we've stored continues to deteriorate while we store it, unless we're rehearsing it. So things that we do over and over and over and over again, we hold on to those really well. Or when we're studying, if we study the same thing over and over again, it's easier and easier for us to remember it. But if we're not using information, like they say with foreign languages, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's what happens with any stored memory. In fact, we usually forget up to 80% of our experiences within hours of them happening. And then also these memories that we have stored can be altered by outside information. So it's normal for us when we have gaps in our memory, it's very normal for us to fill those gaps with outside information, what other people tell us about. And the unfortunate bit about that is that external information may not be accurate. But once we've filled those gaps, whether it's with accurate or inaccurate information, that is now part of the memory, and it's really hard to correct that inaccurate information. In fact, about 25% of people in a famous experiment I'm talking about here, about 25% of people insisted that a false memory that was created for them was accurate, despite being provided overwhelming evidence that it was made up. They just couldn't let go of the fact that it happened. Another thing to keep in mind is trauma victims may have nothing stored. So if they didn't encode what was happening, then they don't have it stored. They don't have anything to remember. And because there's no information there for them to retrieve, they can be really susceptible to remembering false information. And that's remembering in quotes there. And so it's always really important to be careful not to unintentionally mislead a client or a patient by suggesting a particular memory, because it can cause them to use their imagination, or just kind of rely on whatever's being told to them to make that part of their memory. And the big downside of that is then if down the road, let's say they have a forensic evaluation, they come in and their memory doesn't match the collateral information that the forensic psychiatrist looks at. And so the forensic psychiatrist, we then assume either what they're saying didn't happen, or they might even be malingering. So it's that's a big risk. So you got to be really careful not to create false memories. So that lack of memory is often best explored in a clinical context. So if you have a patient who's just like, I can't remember, or a client, sorry, who says, I just can't remember, it's not a bad idea to suggest that they talk to someone about that. And so the last bit here is the recalling and retrieving of information. So there can be errors in retrieval. Your big one, or not one of your big ones, but one of them is the error of omission. So that's where there's just a failure to recall. So it's something they encoded, it's something they stored, but they just can't pull it up again. So it's something that they haven't used in forever, and so it's gone. So it's now an error of omission. And then an error of commission is endorsement of something that did not occur. So this could be lying or exaggeration, or it could be alteration of the initial memory by some external source. And that's often referred to also as source misattribution. So it's in children that can be confusing reality with imagination. Stored memory can also be altered by suggestive interviewing techniques. So children are the most highly susceptible to this, to particular questioning styles. And I'll go over those styles in a little bit here. It's important that children are interviewed by persons who are trained in interviewing children. For example, child advocacy centers are fantastic places where children who have been victims of sexual abuse are interviewed in order to find out the facts of it. They do an excellent job of asking questions in a non-suggestive manner in order to actually find out what the child does or does not remember. Now, using suggestive techniques that damages, as I said before, damages credibility, can damage the credibility of an adult as well as the child. It can be really hard to avoid in children, though, because children oftentimes they don't disclose right away what's happened to them. They may talk to their friends first, and their friends ask questions and fill in memory gaps, and then they may talk to an initial trusted adult, which is typical that they'll talk to a trusted adult first, and that trusted adult tends to ask questions, whether it's a school teacher or whatnot, because they need to get information for a CPS report or some other purpose. And that can cause changes to the memory. And then the school tells the parents, and the parents get really anxious, which is a completely normal reaction. And they start asking the child a lot of questions saying, oh, did they do this? Did they do this? And the child starts picking up, okay, my parents are afraid that this happened, but it seems to be what they want to hear. And so they'll start reporting that, and that changes the child's memory. And then sometimes even police and attorneys may ask questions that change the child's memory, even before a trained professional gets involved. And so oftentimes you've got a lot of people who have caused some interference with the child's memory, who doesn't even get interviewed until weeks, months, or even years after the initial event. And then on top of that, you've got that degradation of time as well that comes with it. So with each passing day, each passing week, each passing month, each passing year, that child's memory of the event is declining. And then, of course, they then even get more questions at deposition or even at trial, which once again can interfere with the memory storage. And so oftentimes what they'll do, particularly with children, so the courts have not been very open to experts coming in to explain memory in cases involving adults. But with children, given that child memory is quite a bit different than adult memory, experts may be called in to educate a jury about the impact of time and suggestive questioning on a child. And adults, like as I said, they are less susceptible to these memory changes. But even their susceptibility increases as they face secondary benefit to those changes.
So,
And then the
Dr.
big
Morgan, we're running a little short on time. So, if you don't mind on the treatment and prognosis, just truncating that so we can get to Jill Moldo's presentation on avoiding further trauma for plaintiff, defendants, and witnesses in the litigation process.
Sorry about
This is
that.
very detailed, and we very much appreciate this information. Uh, Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Let me jump forward to the treatment here then. So yeah, treatment and prognosis. So the course of PTSD, it's not uncommon to be shocked, to have nightmares or intrusive thoughts right after a trauma. But if it's gone on for a month or more, then that's when we start looking at PTSD. In terms of long-term benefit without treatment, about 30% will recover within a year, 40% will have mild symptoms remaining, 20% moderate, and 10% will be unchanged or worse. With treatment, experimentally, there's usually about a 50% recovery. About 50% of people overcome the PTSD symptoms without 15 to 20 weeks of weekly therapy. In practice, though, it's closer to 20 to 30 weeks of treatment to reach that same level. And if somebody has some co-occurring conditions, co-occurring substance use disorder or other diagnoses or personality disorder, it could take 12 to 18 months or even longer to fully recover from PTSD. And the longer someone goes before they get treatment, the less likely they are to recover. And I'm just going to kind of skip through the predictors of positive outcome here. And we already talked about adjustment disorder. So treatment of PTSD. So psychotherapy, pharmacotherapy are your two big treatments for PTSD. So with psychotherapy, there's individual trauma-focused approaches. And I won't go through each individual one there, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that down the road if anybody's interested. And then pharmacotherapy, that's where largely psychiatrists come in, is with the pharmacotherapy. Really good evidence for a lot of antidepressants. Really no evidence at all for benzodiazepines. So that's anything ending with LAM or PAM in their name. Those are generally not going to be helpful and may actually make things worse for a patient. So your most effective treatment overall is going to be a combination of medication and therapy. That said, if only one is available, or if your client or the patient are only willing to go with one treatment, then it's whichever one they want. The one that they're most interested in, have the most faith in, is the one most likely to succeed. Simply because, if you have a positive outlook about how something's going to work, you're going to be more open to it working. And then just as an aside, for adjustment disorders, those are only treated with psychotherapy. Medications aren't appropriate for that. So quickly covering clinical and forensic assessment. About how much time do I have left, Chad?
We're actually a little over time, so I do apologize for having to cut you off, but we thank you very much for your time, Dr. Morgan. We really much appreciate that, and I'm sure that if you're available for consultations or whatnot in the future, that our audience will be happy to reach out to you. We have your contact information right there. And as an aside, for everyone we are going to make all of these slides available for you that attended this event today. It'll be emailed out to you along with a survey about the program. So thank you very much, Dr. Morgan. We really appreciate your time. And if you want to stick around till the end for answers, that would be questions and answers. That would be great. But if you have to go for client needs, we understand that as well. And with that, we will turn the podium over to Jill Mulder to discuss the impact in avoiding further trauma for patients, plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses.
Take it from here. Thanks, Chad. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And my co-presenters, feel free to jump in if you have something to add, and I may even call on you to add. So as I work through, and let's go to the next slide. I'm really talking about, here are these conditions. We know this is going on. What does this mean in terms of your representation and advocacy of patients? I'm talking about the most serious cases here. As you can see, the catastrophic cases, they're highly complex. Catastrophic injuries are usually long-term, extensive injuries and a permanency to them. This is not an easy, simple case. We're not talking about your standard bodily injury case. In these cases, at times you may have both parties that have experienced trauma. It's not unusual. Kelly and I we actually all talked about that a little bit before this seminar. Medical malpractice, a good example of seeing a catastrophic outcome for a patient, the patient's family's traumatized. And then on the other side of the table, you may have a doctor who is experiencing, the fallout of this and in medical error and really severe symptoms of trauma, including potential for self-harm. So don't underestimate, there is risk in the litigation process when you're representing people like this, and you want to avoid re-traumatizing. The good news, it is possible to mitigate that risk. We're doing it right here today, is continuing education on how to approach these cases and understanding these conditions better. Again, understanding the nature and extent of your client's condition. And as you just saw with Dr. Morgan, these aren't simple. There's a lot of different layers, a lot of potential diagnosis. So make sure you understand the actual nature of their condition. Maybe speak to a medical expert on the nature of that. Consider comorbid conditions. As he noted, you can have other disorders connected to this, and understand the impact of that. And I will add, also assess your team. Who do you put together on these cases is crucially important, from your support staff to co-counsel. If you add other members of the team, consider that they are trauma informed. They understand the unique nature of this case, and keeping in mind that people who work on this is sophisticated representation. So when in doubt, I urge you refer out, because there are specialists in our area who can handle this. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the spots that you're going to see kind of an immediate difference is in history taking, and Dr. Morgan touched on this. I've seen this many times in cases, especially with PTSD. The clients struggle with out the gate, usually with a disjointed or kind of incomplete narrative. They often express embarrassment and frustration in not being able to smoothly share their history of what occurred here. They have gaps in memory of events, and somebody talked about with Dr. Morgan, some of those gaps, they may never come back, depending on the circumstances. So you may have to live with that. It's important that you plan ahead with that. Take breaks. One thing I've found is, in especially severe cases, this is a process, history taking. It could take over several days. It could take weeks. I've sat in a room with a co-counsel for 4 hours of going through the same small part of a piece of the story as we go through the facts over and over again with someone. It can be an exhaustive process, but prepare for that in your discussions with the client, that they don't have to do everything at once. Another technique that's important here, and I believe Kelly's going to comment on this too and touch on this a bit, is reframing. Reframing is a technique in communication. This is a little bit, it goes beyond just empathy, right? It's a way to avoid defensiveness for the client and avoid some of that frustration. You reframe your questions, avoid things like, and this is a little more of a simple example, but not questions like, well, why can't you remember this? Or why did you go, why didn't you go to the doctor? Things like that, causing the person to feel defensive, or they can't fully explain why they did it. Instead, reframe of, hey, you're doing great. I want you to be patient with yourself. This is going to take some time. And they show themselves some grace, and that's more likely to produce results. There's some really good resources out there on this technique. There's no way I could cover all of that here, but we've added some resources to this event on tips around that you could learn. Another aspect that you could see in history taking, and that I've seen, is your client's behavior, even in that initial interview, may cause you some confusion. You're not always going to see a big emotion maybe attached to this. And in fact, they may not exhibit any emotions. They may have a very flat affect, which is kind of a robotic way of speaking, or they might be very monotone. They may not show a lot of expression in their face at all. it can be a little disconcerting, and it makes you think, well, what's going on here? That's not unusual. I've also seen clients with a very mixed emotional response. They can go from being like that and very flat, and then suddenly highly emotional, and can catch you off guard or even angry. And that these are not unusual circumstances when someone's had severe trauma. I would say I'd see it more in PTSD. There is an example I wanted to bring up to you just to show the kinds of unusual things that can happen here. I have an attorney friend who shared with me they represented a client who was a veteran, and had severe PTSD. And they had the initial interview with the client and his wife. And at one point, the client got up and left the room. And the attorney thought, oh, okay, maybe he's getting a drink of water or something. And he never came back. And they went to go find him, and he was about a mile down the road, walking down the middle of the road. And he had no awareness of where he was or how he got there. So it was startling for the people involved. This is a little more of an extreme example, but I see Dr. Morgan nodding his head. I mean, this might be called the disassociation, I don't know, doctor, and he certainly really had no awareness of even his environment at the time. So I want you to be prepared. That's a little more unusual situation, but you may see some unusual behavior as you're working with these clients. Next slide. Big part of this is planning is key. So one of the things that we had talked about as a group is how these triggers can happen during the process. Certainly litigation is very unforgiving, in and of itself. It's a major stressor. Sometimes these are called stressors. And you have to prepare your client for these emotional impact of this. They often underestimate what this can do to them, and they're caught very off guard by it. If you have a client that is not working with a mental health professional, and they think, oh, I'm doing better and now I can do this process, I would strongly encourage you to keep, kind of coaching them to please get a mental health professional that can help you through this case. Part of your planning is working with the client on giving them a lot of lead time around important dates and scheduling dates and what could be stressors for them during the process. And when you do this, it gives them an opportunity to then schedule time with their therapist immediately after these events. Like that initial conversation around history, depositions, great example, right? That's a big stressor. Mediation is a big stressor. And I have done this in practice. I've seen it work. This is one of the big ones, I'll tell you. I really encourage you to do that. Encourage your client to work out that schedule ahead of time, even if it's a quick touch base with their therapist immediately after doing one of these things. It can make a big difference in the long term as they go through this. Now, another aspect to planning, again, this is, you're usually having a team approach on this. Be careful who you assign in the office from support staff, a new associate or co-counsel. You, again, discuss with your team about avoiding harm. Discuss framing conversations and the staff not getting frustrated with them if the person is struggling sometimes to share information or respond to discovery requests. I'll share, I saw once a legal assistant, bless her heart, sent an email with smiley face emojis in it to a woman who had lost her son. This is not appropriate. And so have communications with the team. They know how to communicate properly with the clients in these situations. In the converse, be prepared that you may have to remove someone from your team in the office who's working on one of these cases. These are cases with tough facts, and they can have a real emotional impact, especially if it's a new associate or somebody hasn't touched it. People have been doing this 20 years. We're a little hardened to it, and we built up a lot of skills around it of working on these difficult cases. A new associate may not be fully prepared for that. Check in with your team. there can be events that suddenly become traumatic and they're getting overwhelmed. So make sure there is mental well-being. And if it is getting too much for them, I'd recommend that you take them off the case for a while. Next slide. Mediation consideration. Chad may recognize this picture. I took it down from his site because this is one member of his team, it looks like. So I want to talk about mediation separately because I think you should take a more thoughtful approach in these cases with mediation. And in particular, please use a mediator that has years of experience in catastrophic cases. They're going to be much more likely to be trauma informed in their communication. They interact with victims. They understand the challenges. They're going to have a much more sophisticated approach in working with your client. In and in particular, evaluate whether are there unique, parts of your case. Is this one involving sexual harm? Has your mediator ever worked with victims of sexual assault? Ask those questions ahead of time, vet, to get the right person who knows how that communication should look. If it's a case with a child victim, has the mediator worked with children before? What was the nature of that? Make sure the mediator's comfortable with that. And I can't overemphasize too, by the time you get to mediation, you know this client well. And one of the things you figured out are the things that can be emotionally triggering events for them, especially parts of the history of it, and share that with the mediator. Make sure they're fully informed. If they have that information about potential stressors in their conversations around the history of the suit, they're going to be better prepared in speaking to your client. And finally, I'll consider bringing a support person. Your client may need it. I personally experienced this. I was actually opposing counsel, but I quickly agreed to this, knowing the circumstances of the case. And the opposing side, they brought a pastor with who was their support person. And I tell you, it was very effective. It may be a close family member, a pastor, a therapist, and even a support dog, like we see here. And that's okay, but discuss this ahead of time with the mediator. Make sure they're aware and get consent with the parties. The presence of this support person or a support animal can help stabilize that client. Mediation is a long day, especially on a catastrophic case. It is mentally exhausting for anyone who goes through a long mediation. So much more if they have that person there to help support them through that process. You're more likely to achieve your goals too with that. And counsel, opposing counsel, if you're asked about this, I can tell you, I wouldn't be squeamish about allowing this. The same rules will apply for everyone there. And it really, I think, will turn out to be a more productive mediation in the process if you allow it. So, okay, next. All right, as Chad mentioned, we don't, doctors have the oath of first do no harm. We don't really have that. But I will say we do have direction from our state bar and the Michigan Supreme Court, and there are ethical and professional responsibilities that we should, you have to be aware of, in handling these cases and both sides of the table. We added to the handouts for reference the Michigan Supreme Court Administrative Order 2020-2023. It provides direction on civility in the litigation process. I encourage you to reread this. It does speak directly to these issues. The lawyer must not exhibit hostility or create a threatening environment for parties or witnesses. That's important. You should act in good faith. The ABA model rules of professional conduct on this, which were adopted in Michigan on Rule 4.4. Respect for third persons. Lawyers must not use means that have no substantial purpose other than to embarrass, delay, or burden another person. and this is exactly what we're talking about. Zealous advocacy should not mean humiliation of a party or a witness, okay? We don't re-traumatize clients and witnesses, and that is the responsibility of everyone involved. The administrative order includes adjudication of proceedings and covers the judge's role in this as well. They are called upon to address issues in the courtroom and in the process overall of reducing risk of re-traumatizing a party or a witness. So I would say to you, if you are involved in a case where someone's not acting in good faith and you're seeing these issues emerge, escalate to your judge, get it addressed timely, because you also have to make sure that your client is safe and they're not being re-traumatized in this process. Next slide. All right, secondary trauma, sometimes it's called vicarious trauma. I know Kelly's going to spend some time on this, so I want to talk about it high level. You know, our profession rewards bravado, right? There's a lot of that here. Who's the toughest in the room? You know, that's a part of litigation, especially. And even in firms, I'd say there's, you know, kind of a mentality sometimes of being the good soldier, right? Just forge ahead, put your head down and work through. Not always the case with these cases. I'd encourage you, keep an open dialogue among the attorneys on these cases. Check in on well-being. You can have some really tough cases here. And I'll give a personal example of my own introduction into working on catastrophic cases, which I've been involved as a specialty in catastrophic event cases for 20 years now. And my very first case in this, in introduction into a catastrophic case, involved a young girl who was left in a partial vegetative state or minimally conscious state, who was sexually molested in the home by a caregiver her mother hired. And, you know, it's 20 years later and I'm still talking about this case. You know, this isn't something you shake off, right, when you work on a case like this. And I bring it up because the partner who involved me in this case handled this so well. And his approach, he did not just assign this case to me. He came to me and he said, and I want to ask you if you want to work on this case with me. And that's an important difference, isn't it? Especially with new associates working on such a troubling case. He then talked to me about that this case would affect me, that I would be reading terrible things. He talked to me about how this case impacted him. He had been on it for about a year, and his own trauma in working on this case. And then I did work with him on it, and it was over a year. It was a positive, rewarding experience, despite it being truly a horrific case. So I would say if you want to look at a blueprint for the right way, though, to bring an associate into this area of working on catastrophic cases and being prepared, and this is the way to do it. I thought this was the way to do it. Dr. Morgan, when we were all preparing for this, one of the recommendations I thought I would make sure I shared here is really think about getting a mental health professional for yourself, especially on these really difficult cases. You know, that's not a weakness, okay? And some of these can have really tough facts or for everyone involved. And it's good to touch base with someone on your own mental well-being as you work through that. All right, next slide. So trauma involving children or sexual assault cases, I want to talk about these as a little bit of a subset. Children, you know, when we talk about this a little bit, Dr. Morgan did touch on this, is, you know, these are really kind of situations where you need a more enhanced support system. Sometimes the parents say, well, I'm here, you know, I'm taking care of the kid. Again, please make sure there's a mental health professional involved, especially with a child victim. And again, communicate that long lead time, because there may be instances where the therapist needs to be involved even during one of these events, and to be a support person, but certainly immediately after triggering events on the litigation. So that type of preparation is key. Cases involving sexual assault or child victims, they may involve simultaneous civil and criminal proceedings. Don't make the mistake of losing track of what's going on in the criminal proceeding. Make sure you know the dates and the developments taking place on that process. And then I even have, like, I've had this situation happen where I have the client contact me the next day, the next morning, and actually just debrief. Let me know what happened. How did it go? Did anything strange or unusual happen? Another thing I encourage you from a scheduling standpoint, it may be that you need to work with your judge on rescheduling. You want people to have time for recovery, build in that time. You don't want a deposition being taken of a client who just finished a sentencing hearing, right? And had to testify at a sentencing hearing. These people need time to recover. So communicate that with your judge. Again, they don't want to have this person re-traumatized. So some dates and some ballast in between could be a better approach. For mediation of cases with sexual assault or molestation, again, take some steps around discussing issues of safety with the client. This is a good spot for expert consultation. You know, they may help you with a greater awareness of what questions to talk about with the client. You know, would they feel a female mediator makes them more safe if they go to mediation? Does the environment of the mediation, the location, does that make them feel safe? Be careful about that. Think about things like that. Do they need more breaks? And then in your own firm, again, selection of counsel, team, mediator, these would all be people who are experienced in these areas. They've had experience with sexual assault victims, are well-versed in the facts of the case, or they work with cases involving child victims before. So, and Kelly will be visiting this further. Next. So I do want to talk about the potential for a bit of a worst case scenario that can come up is a client at risk of self-harm. It's a rare event. It does happen. I think it's a great idea, and I really want to emphasize this because it works, is planning ahead. Make sure people at your firm are working on this case. Plan ahead for that. I recommend that in your initial discussions with the client, find out, do they have a family member in the home who's their support person through this? Or it could be someone outside the home. I've had it sometimes they go, oh, I have a best friend, but they're 2 hours away, or somebody else. And that's, don't, you know, encourage them to get somebody else. You want someone who's close by, who potentially could get to the home quickly to be with them. And so work that out ahead of time, get the name of the support person and their contact information as well for your file. You may have the support person contact you. They may already be, you know, on site, being called into this, and they're having some doubts. Do I bring them in? I don't know what to do right now. Err on the side of caution. Tell them, go ahead, take them, you know, if this is a crisis situation, take them into the emergency room for evaluation. As Dr. Morgan mentioned, a lot of communities now have these 24-hour psychiatric urgent care. That's a great option. So have awareness of that as well. They can, you know, if you have, I keep the hotline number for one of those, and I can pass that off. Keep the person on the line, make sure the support person gets there and they are on site before you drop off the call. You can text while you're talking, right? So most of the time, this is somebody reaching out who they're going through a bad moment. Just let them go through the bad moment with you. Okay, let them talk about it. But you know, if you are dealing with a scenario of potential self-harm, all that planning can help avoid stress for them and for you. Remember, do your best. That's all you can do in these situations. Next. All right, and I have some takeaways, and I know I kind of worked through my stuff, but we can't put everything out here. It would be another hour, but my general takeaways on this is really being trauma informed, doing your homework, educating yourself, and then all of that planning up front. It will absolutely quickly reflect back in the work with the client. It absolutely builds trust and safety, and you will get better results. I've seen that firsthand. I would also emphasize it's important for you to be conscious of secondary trauma. Seek professional help. I've seen attorneys, I know attorneys who started running into trouble with self-medicating, dealing with depression through these things. Even people are very experienced in this area. It can catch up with them. Open the door to talk to a colleague, and then get the help you need, the professional help you need. So, those two things together, professional support, planning, and expert support, don't disregard the use of experts in these areas to help you, and then preparation of your associate and staff. And finally, judicial awareness of safety, so critically important. It really does have a significant impact on the overall safer process as the judge is involved, and then escalating these matters to the judge. I've included a link here, I think is a great link, the SAMHSA link. I find this really valuable to turn to. It has trauma-informed toolkits and guidance on trauma with children and talking to children, many resources. So feel free to save that. That's a great place for it. I'll just say overall, I think our profession has come a long way in awareness on behavioral health. And so we should feel really positive about that. And then we can just keep this going, make it better for our clients. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chad.
Thank you, Jill. That was really informative, valuable information. And while Kelly gets her slides up, thank you all for being here today. We are running a little bit over the program, but you're going to be awarded and rewarded with some good knowledge right now from Kelly. And to follow up on what Jill just said about seeking assistance, I'm going to put in the chat the Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program, the LJAP program, run by the State Bar of Michigan and the wonderful Molly Rands. Taking care of ourselves is a critical component of civility and professionalism. You're on mute, Kelly, sorry.
I was like, I remember to do this, and of course I didn't. So, so as Chad said, I'm Kelly Clement. Thanks, Jill, for handing it off. And I did want to mention, Jill, while you were presenting and had the therapy dogs up, Kathleen Feeney shared that some of the courts actually have this process in place already. Sounds like there's a program at Kent County and others throughout the state of Michigan. So just a little tidbit of information there for folks if they want to have that available for any of their clients, because I agree. I think that's a great resource. But I kind of want to get into now talking about how we can identify people that are actively going through some of this victimology. I know we've talked a lot about, the first party victims, the patients, the family members, but there's also, secondary victims and even tertiary victims. And when I say second victims, I'm really talking about those healthcare providers that were involved in the event, that actively participated either with the events leading up to, during the event, or even recovering the patient after. They're really exposed in a traumatic event. And unfortunately, it's something that never really leaves them. As we talk about the victimology behind this and the stages that the providers go to, they really ruminate on these issues, and they are continually exposed with them because, when something goes wrong, we want to look at it, see if there's process improvement. That can be a triggering event, and how you reframe things, how you question things. When they have to go through the legal proceedings and get, cross-examined, if there's any licensing action. These are all things that are continually exposing somebody to the trauma that they've had. And so as an attorney, you really want to be avoiding any kind of activities that could re-trigger this, or also that could make it worse. I recently spoke to a friend who was involved in the legal process, I want to say 10 years ago. It might have even been longer. And unfortunately, her case has been brought up for a reason completely unrelated to her part of it. And I was talking to her and she's like, I feel like I get over it and then something else comes up and it's just this wound that never closes. And, I talked to her because we're friends, but I think about the patients, the family members, the providers, and other people that were involved that don't have somebody to touch base with. And they just have this, festering wound that continues to be open. And unfortunately, with this, you can lose your healthcare providers. So I know that that's a large concern of healthcare industry is that we can lose our providers if they're not appropriately cared for after these traumatic events because they just can't handle it. They can either kind of acclimate and continue to work in healthcare, or they're faced with a situation that they don't feel that they continue to do this. I've unfortunately been involved in a situation where a provider did leave. They weren't actively involved in the event as it happened, but were part of the crew, the team that responded. And after I spoke with her, I was worried about her, had her manager call in and check with her. And about 3 weeks after the event, the manager let me know that she put in her 2 weeks. And it was just something that she couldn't overcome. So it impacts everybody. And we really want to try to avoid re-traumatizing them. So what are kind of some of the symptoms you should be looking out for in your clients or, when you're interviewing people? So the first thing that I think can probably be frustrating as well is that they have trouble with their memories. I know Dr. Morgan spoke about this, but sometimes they can have no memory. They can have their memory, but then they almost get a memory that's been developed from talking to other participants that were there, being interviewed by hospital staff, being interviewed by attorneys. Their memory really does almost wax and wane. And this has been proven that victims, especially with sexual assault trauma, that is actually part of how you know that it was a very traumatic event is that change in memory, the fact that they're not able to have this one solid story that goes through. So I think when you're seeing people like that, that's one thing to, kind of note that this might be someone who's already suffering from trauma exposure, and we need to have impacts with them. You can also see, anxiety, anger, distress. They could be embarrassed. They feel guilty. They can't sleep through this. And all of those things are going to be able to impact them going forward. When an event happens, they have to still show up to the same hospital, continue their work. So it's really important to keep a lookout because if these signs and symptoms aren't treated, it could go all the way to PTSD, as Dr. Morgan had talked about, but we're looking at burnout. We're looking at depression. You could have prolonged grief disorder. You could have problems with substance abuse. I think we know that the diversion of medications is a problem in healthcare, and this can pre-expose them if they need that to get through with their day-to-day life. You get a lot of job stress, fatigue on the job, and it really just leads to them being very dissatisfied. And so we want to try to avoid any kind of re-victiming. But we also have to be cognizant that it's going to be I forgot about this little titch that I added on there, but our most exposed people, the ones that actively show symptoms, and this is just in their day-to-day activity, not necessarily after an event, but you can see in some high-risk areas, the ER, the ICU, our surgery residents, about a quarter of them have signs of the symptoms of being a second victim just from general exposure in the healthcare facility. So it might not even be that an adverse event happened. It could just be that the event was traumatic for them and very impactful for them. We also know that there are third victims involved in this. And I actually, as I was putting this together, I thought it really fit well with presenting to you guys, our, med mal attorneys, because you guys, in my mind, could also be third victims and would also want to, kind of be aware of what that is and what to be looking for. But really what third victims are is it's just the idea that they don't live in isolation. They affect everybody. And there are certain people that are going to be predisposed to being a third victim. These are, risk managers in the healthcare facility, the claims managers, the patient safety personnel, but then also I think defense attorneys and plaintiff attorneys and possibly even judges, right? Because we are inundated with negative stories, bad outcomes, sad cases. People were injured, they lost loved ones. And we don't get that counterbalance of positive stories, right? So we're not on the units caring for the patient where we see the miraculous, 16-year-old who is practically brain dead walk into the PICU and say hi to everybody. We don't get those miraculous appointments. We don't get those positive stories. And so the cumulative exposure of just these negative stories to us can put us into a victim space where we can have trauma related behaviors and be traumatized by this. We are not only investigating it, you become almost a support person to the patient, the family, the providers that were involved. And so being that support person can also put stress on you. I think we know that as caregivers, you have to take almost better care of yourself to be an efficient caregiver for your ill loved one. So really just being cognizant that you could also be a part of this, the victim cycle. And it might even lead into something that's really being discussed a lot right now in healthcare is the imposter syndrome. And this is really something that is seen in kind of, it's really prevalent in academia and healthcare, but I would also think attorneys as well, because these are, very high functioning, highly achieving individuals that have done really well. In their areas of expertise, but they're not able to internalize that success for some reason. Either it's an exposure to the negative aspects of healthcare, the sad stories, the bad outcomes, or if it's just something in their nature, they're not able to internalize that success. And so you really start to see that over preparation or procrastination. They prepare to make it perfect, or they feel that they're not good enough because they're procrastinating. They didn't get it done by the deadline and now it's coming in later. So it's really important that you're also looking for some of these signs and symptoms in your colleagues, not alone just your clients. And again, you see the same kind of symptoms as you would see with second victims. You see the anxiety, depression, stress, loss of interest in the job, loss of effectiveness at the job. And so the one thing that all of these victims have in common is that they need help and they need support to get through this. So really, I think the most important thing I would say is know the signs and symptoms and listen and hear what your client is telling you. They may be looking at you and saying, I'm having the best day of my life, but that's not what's being felt by that. So you really need to meet the individual where they're at. I think this is especially important in sexual assault trauma cases, but you got to know the terminology as well, right? So do they identify as a victim? Do they identify as a survivor? There's different terminology in there. There could also be pronouns, gender identity, things that need to be worked through with those cases as well. So you want to make sure that you're meeting the person where they're at and that you're being non-judgmental. I know that it can be frustrated when individuals cancel meetings last minute. They have memory issues. They're frustrated. They're twitchy. Just try to be non-judgmental in that area. If you have someone that is struggling with being involved in the adverse event, schedule breaks in your depositions. Plan for them. Don't let them have to ask for that advice. Make sure that if they are having a meeting, they have someone there that is their supportive person. There are limited options of who we can have in some of those meetings, but make sure they have somebody there that's available for them. If they are a client, like a plaintiff or a patient or a family member, like I think of them, what resources do they have through their insurance companies or even through their workplace? A lot of workplaces now are focusing on mental health and care. And so they have those resources available to them as well. At Bronson, we have HelpNet, we have Physician Wellness. We've got a lot of different resources. So it's good to know what's available at their company because there may be resources that are free to them that they're not aware of. I will also say that it is great when you can focus on and switch and have them focus on self-care. So I know that when my providers and when my employees are getting prepared for depositions, I'm always asking what they're doing the weekend before and the weekend after, because I don't want their nose to the book the full weekend before. I want them to take the time, make sure their mental health is in a good place. When scheduling, depositions, be cognizant if people work night shift, even with plaintiffs, they could be working night shift. Try to schedule at their leisure. Do we need to schedule in the evening? Do we need to schedule away from the hospital? Especially, I think, with plaintiffs and clients, sometimes having depositions, meetings, disclosures at the hospital is not the location that you want to be at. You want to pull these things away from the hospital in an area that is not as triggering for them. I don't think I can recommend therapy enough. I think Jill even said it, everyone should be in therapy. So I think it's really important as well. And, check in and see if that's an option for them, because I think when you know that, you feel less pressure helping support them, but be like, oh, is this something that you've talked to your therapist about? Or is this something that you would bring to them? I think it also helps you give your clients an option and something that they can tangibly do. Being in healthcare, I love healthcare related resources. So I think Chad shared that she's actually on the webinar today. So I love Dr. Gita Pensa has some great things available on her website. Doctors, we've been kind of sending them over. She's working with some companies in our area. And so that's kind of how it got over in West Michigan. But anyone that has listened to the podcast has been really supportive of it. They really enjoy it. They enjoy the materials on the website. So just want to give a shout out to Dr. Pensa and her work in that. It's been really well received by the providers so far. So thank you for making those available. And then also, there was a lot of work done at Duke with Dr. Sexton with resiliency and well-being at Duke. And so they did a workshop with 3 good things, and they did studies to see how those 3 good things would impact you. So once a day, you type in what were 3 good things in your day, and it prompts you and reminds you. And it's something little that reintroduces positivity almost in your life, I think of it. And so that's another really great area that you can reach out to. Obviously, a little more healthcare focused, so not appropriate for everybody, but I think it's something as well that attorneys need to be aware of that's out there, so that they can also set the opportunities. I think you guys have your finger and your pulse on your clients more so than the entities you may represent. And I think it's wonderful. And so just being able to use and share these resources amongst everyone, I think is really important. And so, Chad, I was gonna, just kind of stop with some victim support things and what we could do. And so I didn't know if I wanted to turn back to you. I think we got all the questions.
Well, I will tell you that number one, that was fantastic. And I want to voice my appreciation because Kelly is someone who truly practices what she preaches. I've worked with her on a number of cases over the years, and I've seen her employ in practice day to day the very things that she's talking about, and she makes our world and our community a better place because of it. And with that, let me just thank all of our speakers. We have, an audience that ranges from brand new associate lawyers all the way to our most experienced judges and lawyers. And today's podcast or webinar offered something for everybody. We had a detailed, comprehensive review of the diagnostic criteria and treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We had some practices that you can put in place right away in your practice to help prevent further re-traumatizing. We learned about our Supreme Court's Administrative Order 2023 and how these principles of trauma-informed advocacy parallel and mirror and mesh exactly. And we found that there were day-to-day preventative and self-care that we can use for both ourselves, our teams, and our patients and clients to help them avoid being traumatized as well and to limit the harm that's being done. So thank you to all of our speakers and to our audience for attending. I hope you all have a wonderful day.